Smoky Hill family, how is everybody? Good. Thank you again so much. I shared a couple weeks ago about my experience of being in Guatemala and getting to see Convoy of Hope on the ground. And thank you. Thank you for continuing to faithfully give, that we can partner. And in times like this, it's always hard to go, man, what do I do? What do I do? And you're already doing that faithfully. So thank you. And we will continue to partner with them as they reach those both domestically and internationally. We're so thankful for that. So for those online, I apologize because you're going to get this a little bit delayed. We're having some network issues, so it doesn't mean we don't love you. It is an invitation to come in person next week if you'd like to. And actually last week it was Larkspur Church that was having some problems. So, we're just going to trade back and forth, right? How about we just be done with it? But in the meantime, thank you for your patience. We'll see you online soon, and really you are welcome to come in person any week. And next week, if you're interested in hearing more about the Guatemala trip, we're going to be sharing at our sister church on the 20th. After service, we're going to have our hangout for Larkspur Church, and we'll have some sharing from the missions trip. We're actually going to have our baptism. You guys are welcome to come there as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to just let me know. And some of you tonight might be going, who is this lady? Like, I don't even recognize her, but I have been gone for a few weeks, but I have to tell you, it is with such a grateful heart to be back with you. I had some great ministry opportunities over the last month, and I was gone in July, 21 of 25 days, not at home, which was a bit much if you ask me. So it is with a hugely grateful heart to see your faces and be here with you again. So tonight, I want to invite you into a journey, okay? I want you to take a moment and remember when you were young. Some of you are getting ready to launch college students. Some of you are just launching your kids back to school this week. I want you to remember in those moments when you were that age, what was it like? What did you think your life was going to be like? You can close your eyes. You don't need to look at me. You can genuinely, I want you to think about all those feelings of the unknown and maybe the excitement of what's to come and what you think life was going to be like. And I mean, if I put myself back in my 13-year-old shoes, I was pretty sure I was going to be playing collegiate volleyball. And as a junior, in junior high, I had a varsity coach in our district actually recruiting me. She was a high school coach who would use that as a way to actually feed her collegiate team. And so she had actually petitioned the district that I could come and play on her team as a junior high student, which, if you can tell from my athleticism and my tall stature, how is that clearly not God's plan for me, right? It wasn't. But I definitely felt in this recruiting space and in this I'm going to get to play as a seventh grader on a varsity team in high school. Those dreams all got dashed, but I was pretty sure in the moment that that's what it would look like. And later in life, those iterations of dreams may have looked a little bit different. I had a plan of how old I was going to be when I got married and when I had my kids and when I was done. By 30, I was going to be moving on, right? From having kids. And you can imagine my surprise at 34 when I was in my third pregnancy and had just delivered my first baby girl 3 years prior and had lost a baby in between and was now working on my third pregnancy after having inherited 3 kids. None of this fit in my plan of what I thought life was going to look like. In fact, there were many inflection points in my life that looked quite different than I thought they would. And maybe this experience resonates for you in some way. Maybe there are places in your life where you're man, I thought it might look a little different than it's turning out. What did you think your future might look like when you were a teenager or young adult, or maybe freshly married wife or husband, maybe freshly divorced? Maybe there were promises that you thought were going to come through that were never fulfilled or ended up being fulfilled in a way that was really, really different than what you anticipated. Did you also hold any illusions of grandeur like I did? And as we've been traveling through this series, The Hall of Flaws, we've been considering those characters that are listed throughout Hebrews 11 as the representation of the heroes of the faith, right? And yet, as we've uncovered over and over again in this series, we keep seeing that these are people whose lives are so full of mistakes and flaws that if we're honest, sometimes we're surprised that they made the list, right? Which is essentially and inherently why they're on the list, as we've talked about. Now, let me ask you, whose life has turned out exactly like you anticipated it would? Anyone? I was honestly kind of processing through as I was writing this message, oh yeah, that person, I thought, and I'm I actually don't think anyone's lives, how clueless we all were, right? debt, depression, kids who disappoint in their choices, unfulfilling careers, and unexpected diagnosis. Seasons that we might have mistakenly put our faith into things rather than the one who actually deserves it. Perhaps some of us experienced traumatic childhoods that left us wounded and carrying out unconscious patterns throughout our adulthood in our relationship and in our lives. So tonight we're going to dive into the story of Moses, and we're going to continue a few of the poignant places, the inflection points in his life that I just love Moses. If you don't know this about me, I could actually probably do a whole series just on Moses. So we might be here for a week straight, but that would be okay. But most of us know something about Moses as a leader, right? Most of us would maybe remember the guy who stood up to Pharaoh, the guy who delivered the Israelites from slavery and oppression into the promised land that God said, the one who performed these crazy, miraculous signs at the hand of God, maybe the fulfilling warrior who went where no one had gone yet, right? One of his most well-known acts, of course, was his role in receiving the 10 Commandments, inscribed directly from God's hand to the tablet. And I found this funny picture from worldhistory.org, which I was like, this is so bizarre. But God's literally writing on the tablet, which was kind of an interesting picture. Or perhaps you're more keen on remembering Moses parting the Red Seas. And I don't know about you, but this is a picture that I think about when I think of Moses, this powerful, fearless man standing up to a huge wall of water, parting the Red Sea with courage, literally going across on dry ground where no one has gone before. But I would argue tonight, as we consider the life of Moses, the inflection points that I want us to pay a little bit more attention to look something more like this. And this picture, if you can tell, is Moses fleeing from Egypt, literally running with all his might. I did try to do Candace's thing where I went to the chat GPT and tried to do images. John Cena, I ran out of attempts. Apparently, I'm not as good at this as him. So we look forward to when he's back from sabbatical. But in Hebrews 11, starting in verse 23, these are the things that we learn about Moses. We learn that Moses is actually first mentioned in Hebrews 11, not for anything he's done, but for what his family has, the faith of his parents. So 23 says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Next, we learn that Moses refused to be identified with Pharaoh's family. In 24 through 26, we read, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. And then in Hebrews, they pretty much take the next 40 years of Moses' life and summarize it like this. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And by faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. And then perhaps the pinnacle of his leadership, Hebrews mentions the parting of the Red Sea. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Now, before we make assumptions about Moses' faith being and his leadership marked only by success or incredible dramatic turns for the Israelites because of his faithfulness, I want us to back up to the beginning of his life and consider what Moses would have experienced as a child, a young man, his formative experiences in leading the Israelites, and then what the fulfillment of promise looked like at the very end of his life. And one of the most important things I believe we can gather from the heroes in Hebrews 11 is something I recently heard Rick Warren share, and that is that broken trees bear fruit. Broken trees bear fruit. And we're going to come back to this, but I just feel like that was such a succinct way of even summarizing this entire series through Hebrews. So Moses' story begins in Exodus 2. Moses, whose father and mother both were of the tribe of Levi, he was born during a very tumultuous time where the king of Egypt had given an edict that the midwives were to kill any male babies that were born. But it says in verse 20 that the God-fearing midwives did not do this, and so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. I don't want us to miss out the fact that these Egyptian midwives actually were the agents of multiplying God's kingdom in Egypt while they were oppressed, while they were in slavery. It reminds me a lot of the story Mike shared yesterday, or last week, where Sisera was killed by a woman who was not even an Israelite woman, who she received the victory from the battle. And God can use anybody he wants to, anyone, which is so encouraging to me. And I love that about this series. God was kind to the midwives, and then Israel prospered. What a thing. So Moses' mother saw he was a fine child, and she hid him. She prepared a basket of papyrus, like reeds, where she was weaving them together, creating a basket. Then she covered it with tar and pitch, and she placed the child among the reeds in the Nile River. This is crazy, right? Some of you right now may feel a little bit like Moses' mother. I was thinking this week that I have a number of friends who are launching kids for the first time into seasons that feel like, oh, I hope I've woven that strong enough around them. I hope I've protected them enough and given them enough coverage that they'll actually float in the midst of the world. Even us, we're ushering our oldest son into marriage this week and going, these are seasons where we launch our kids, but we don't get to go with them, do we? And so I couldn't help but relate to Moses' mother in this moment. We see in Exodus 2 that Moses is placed into the basket, and actually as he's kind of released, his sister is following and watching what's going to happen. And we know, of course, Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, is at the river. She sees this basket in the reeds and sends her servants over to go and investigate and find out what it is. And as they discover it's a baby, she correctly identifies him as a Hebrew baby. Now, his clever sister pops out, and she comes and she says, hey, do you want me to find an Israelite wet nurse or a Hebrew wet nurse who could take care of this baby for you? And so she agrees. They actually then the sister runs and brings Moses' mother and reunites the two, where she gets to raise him until the point where he can actually go and be raised in Pharaoh's household. Now, we have the luxury of reading the story in hindsight, don't we? We know Moses made it. He became a great leader of God. This wasn't the end of his story, to be abandoned by his mother and left in a basket. But let us not lose sight of how tumultuous this actually was, how traumatizing and disruptive the story was to an entire family. Young parents full of hopes and dreams about what their child's life would look like, what their family would look like as they add him. Dreams that are disrupted by a powerful and fear-filled king, and they have no control to change those other than hiding him and then releasing him into the great unknown. A selfless act of sending your child into this unknown, trusting he will then be cared for in someone else's hands. A sister grieving, possibly feeling responsible, or maybe just really clever and creative enough to follow her brother's basket and find how to make a way for him to stay intact in the family just a bit longer. And for Moses, the disruption of being sent out, then return to your family, then sent out once again. I don't care how young you are, this disruptiveness is quite impacting. Ruth Haley Barton, in her book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, says this: we might at least acknowledge that Moses' early childhood experiences were quite traumatic by any standard. He was born into an environment that was highly unsafe and volatile for children, abandoned by his mother, even though it was for the best of reasons. He was then reunited with his birth family, only to be returned to an adoptive family later on. Raised in a pagan environment that was fundamentally different from the environment in which he had spent his early years, an environment that prohibited him from living and worshiping with his family and his fellow Hebrews according to the traditions of his own heritage. He lived between two worlds and yet was not fully at home in either place. What a disruptive upbringing. And I wonder what Moses' parents expected the life of their young Hebrew boy to look like. I doubt they expected it to turn out the way that it did. I wonder what Moses himself imagined as he went through all of these changes and as a teenager and growing up in these two places where he didn't fit in either one completely. What did he imagine his life would be like? So I would call this season of inflection in Moses' life one that was preparation for Moses' call into leadership. The first inflection point, as we move in out of kind of this early season and into what we see in Exodus 2:11 to 25, they fast forward to where Moses is now completely grown up, okay? And he went out he's been living at Pharaoh's household, right? He's got all of the authority and privilege of being in a king's home. And he goes to watch his people as they're working and being mistreated as slaves to the Egyptians. So Moses, all grown up, goes out to watch his own people in their hard labor, and he witnesses an Egyptian who is beating a Hebrew. Exodus 2:12 says, looking this way and that and seeing no one, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now this is the epitome of what I would call, premeditated murder, right? He was enraged by what he saw, so much so that he ensured no one else was around and looking. He then killed him and buried him in secret, thinking no one would know. But it wasn't in secret, and in fact, the very next day, as he's trying to help these two Hebrews who are fighting, it steps in, and they're like, hey, are you thinking of killing me too, like you killed the Egyptian? Oh no, Moses and his murdering tendency has been found out. Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. Have you ever had this type of Moses experience where something that you wished would just never come to the surface is all of a sudden raised directly in your face? One in which the weight of your own sin or your actions come crashing down on you. You become so afraid, even potentially running, as we saw Moses do. We see, in fact, that Moses, even though he thought he was quite secret, it was well known. And in fact, it made its way to Pharaoh, that when he heard about it, he tried to kill Moses. This is now the second time Pharaoh has tried to kill Moses, or at least the second time. Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. So Ruth Haley Barton goes on to explain that Moses' flaws came in a most profound way, right? She says, all of us develop ways of adjusting and staying safe in the midst of whatever danger or difficulty is present in our environment. We develop patterns before we're conscious that we're doing so. And it appears that one of Moses' coping mechanisms was to repress his anger since he had nowhere to go with it. But he also used that anger to power up in relation to others, to control situations that seemed out of control. And one day his anger that had probably been building up for quite a long time, got the best of him and everything exploded. When he saw the Egyptian abusing the Hebrew, his anger overwhelmed him and he killed the Egyptian. Then he tried to hide his sin by burying the body in the sand, and this reactive and out of control response was a snapshot of Moses' leadership before he went into solitude. So often we think of Moses as a young man, maybe unable to control his rage, like you think of like teenage boy, like testosterone driven, like, oh, But honestly, Moses at this point is 40 years old. He's 40. He's just a couple years younger than me. Like, I would think he would have figured some of this out by now, right? She goes on to say that Moses fled into solitude. He didn't walk, he didn't jog, he didn't stop to try to figure out what was going on and what had happened, or to put his affairs in order. He fled into solitude. Parker Palmer, from his book Leading from Within, says a leader is a person who must take special responsibility for what's going on inside him or herself, inside his or her consciousness, lest the act of leadership create more harm than good. So as many flaws as we see in Moses up to this point, and in fact in his fear he's fleeing, there's also a piece where God's going to use this space of solitude, I think, to force Moses to take special responsibility for what's going on inside of him and to dismantle those coping mechanisms that he's bound up in. So Moses takes off, flees to Midian. He sits down by a well, and there are 7 girls, daughters, sisters that show up, and they are the daughters of the priest, and they've come to water the flocks. And while they're there, a bunch of shepherds show up, and they're harassing the women, and Moses steps in and saves them, kind of rescues them. In the end, Moses ends up marrying one of these women, and he is, for 40 years, tending his father-in-law's flocks in the wilderness by the mountain of God. 40 years. So he had this tumultuous 40-year, this inflection point, and then another 40 years of living in his own space of wilderness. The commencement of this point in Moses' life, his exhibiting the most uncontrolled of behavior, sinning, committing murder, fleeing to Midian, going about his life. He works a job, he gets married, he has a family, he's doing all of the life things that we do, right? But this second inflection point is God's call into leadership. It took 40 years for the Lord to sort out whatever it was, an additional 40 years, whatever it was that he needed to be able to call Moses to his purpose. In Exodus 3, the Lord appears to him in the flames of fire from within a bush, which, as it turns out, there's this bush that actually self-combusts in the desert. Have you ever heard of this? It literally, this in and of itself is actually not that unusual. What caught Moses' attention about it is that it was not consumed. It continued to burn. It was not consumed and did not burn up. And so his attention was caught in the midst of the ordinary. Exodus 3, God makes himself known to Moses. He calls Moses by name from the burning bush. He tells him, this is holy ground, take off your shoes. And then he tells him who he is. And then he proceeds to tell Moses why he's making himself known. Exodus 3:7 says, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Have you ever questioned if God is concerned with your suffering? Have you ever wondered, does he even know or hear where I'm crying out? I find great comfort in being reminded that God himself sees me, hears my cries, and is full of concern for all of us in the exact same way that he was for the Israelites in their oppression. So God, in his explanation, he calls Moses and he says, I've come down to rescue them, to bring them out of the land and into a good and spacious land, flowing with milk and honey. So now go, he tells Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out. Okay, so we have a whole lot of stuff. If you don't know much about Moses' history, he's across all these books in the Old Testament. So I was thinking about funny memes, could I just summarize funny? But I thought maybe I'd just summarize a few lines of the conversation over the next 12 chapters. You ready? This is how it goes. Moses and God's interchange. Moses, after being called by the Lord in a burning bush, by name, right, very clearly, he's who am I to do anything? God says, I'm with you, and we'll do all kinds of miraculous signs. In fact, you're going to come back here, and you're going to worship God on this mountain. Moses is who are you? Again, who are you? God says, I am. There's a whole bunch of theological significance and beauty in this, I am who I am. But let's just say we can just all agree that God is all-knowing, and he's presenting himself to Moses as the all-knowing God. Moving into Exodus 4, we see at this point, we're clued into the fact that Moses himself is running up against expectations that don't meet what he thought his life was going to look like, right? He fled, it feels like for 40 years, he's been in hiding, he's been kind of covered, right? This clearly was not what 13 or 24 or 40-year-old Moses expected to happen in his life. This is not the story that he wrote for himself. In fact, I find reading this story very similar to what Chandace shared with us about Gideon. Do you remember Chandace? He was so good at saying, excuse me, Lord, right? Moses has a very similar thing. Moses, what if they don't believe me? This is his response to God. God says, hey, check out these miraculous signs. He does some cool things where Moses' staff becomes a snake. And do you know what Moses does? Runs from it. Because that's what Moses has been doing, if we haven't noticed his pattern. But then God says, pick it up. He picks it up. It returns to his staff. Then God says, hey, stick your hand in your cloak. And then Moses pulls it out, and he's like, what? I'm leprous now? This call is going to mean I'm leprous? And God says, hey, stick it back in your cloak. He does, and it comes back restored and clean like the rest of his skin. And then God says, hey, if that's not enough, those crazy examples, you could pick up water from the Nile and put it on the ground. It's going to turn to blood, okay? So Moses, in his convinced state, after all these crazy things just happened, returns to our familiar Gideon strategy, and he says, pardon your servant, Lord, I don't speak very well. Do you remember that? I don't speak very well. And God says, who gave you that mouth? And then Moses says, pardon your servant, Lord. Can't someone else do it? Can't anyone else do it? God says, my anger burns against you, and Moses has nothing to say to that. I imagine maybe he's cowering, maybe he's wanting to run, maybe he's shrugging his shoulders. I don't know. But then God says, how about Aaron, your brother? He speaks well. He can speak for you, and you take the staff and perform the miraculous signs that I said. And so Moses, in his obedience, goes. He goes to Jethro, his father-in-law, and says, hey, Jethro, I got to go see if any of my people are still alive in Egypt, okay? Jethro says, go, I wish you well, I bless you. And God says, hey, remember Moses, go and perform those signs that I told you about. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, so he's actually not going to let the people go. I know I told you to go do that, but just FYI, be prepared, okay? This may have been a little discouraging for Moses. I don't know. Probably not how he would have even written this next level of interaction with Pharaoh or the Israelites or his life. So then Moses goes, hey, Pharaoh, with your hard heart, I'm actually going to kill your firstborn because you won't let Israel's firstborn go. Now, this simplified kind of summary of the story might tip us off to the reality that Moses is in a calling that isn't easy, and he likely wouldn't have chosen or expected it. And in fact, quite frankly, he's not so sure that his own flaws can be overcome to step into what God has called him to. So Moses and Aaron then go back to Egypt. They have these really interesting back and forth dialogues with Pharaoh, the new one, not the one who initially wanted to kill him. Exodus 4 and 5, I'd summarize this way. Moses and Aaron, hey, we go, we show up, we perform miracles. And they say, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh's like, I don't know this guy. I don't know the Lord. Why would I let my people go? They're my laborers. Why would I do that? Moses and Aaron, okay, look, maybe you could just let us go into the wilderness for 3 days. We'll go have a ceremony. We'll sacrifice to our Lord. That's what we need to do. Pharaoh's like, why are you taking my people from their labor? No. In fact, get back to work. And I'm going to make it harder than it was before because you're a bunch of lazy people who are trying to get out of your work. The slave drivers say, now you have to make bricks without any of the straw. Before they used to give them straw from Pharaoh. And now they're like, hey, good luck, Israel. Go find your own straw. Oh, and you still have to make the same number of bricks every day. Exodus 5, 19 through 21, the Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, you're not to reduce the number of bricks required of you each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you, servants of God. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. The people begin to turn against God's servant. In their suffering, they accuse Moses and Aaron of being the agents of their death. This is a pretty intense accusation, and I want you to remember they're speaking to someone who took a man's life. What a tender and raw and vulnerable place as he steps into the leadership God has called him to, that they cut his feet right out from underneath him. You are a murderer. You are the agent of our death now. It's pretty intense stuff, right? Now, I want to give you some high-level patterns that we see from Exodus 5 all the way through Exodus, 17 is where we're going next. This is pretty much what happens. The Israelites blame their suffering on Moses and Aaron and accuse them over and over again of being the agents of their death. Moses turns to God and says, help my people. That is Moses' response, help. God responds. And then Moses is often quoted as, reminding him, hey, I still don't want to do this. Did you know that, God? I still don't want to do this. But then God delivers explicit instruction and says, go and do this. And he does it. And God is faithful. Aaron and Moses continue to do what the Lord commands them. Exodus 7 through 12, the Israelites, think about this. They still have to live. They're in the land of Egypt when all of the plagues hit, right? So they already are kind of miffed with Aaron and Moses, and then all of a sudden all of the plagues start hitting to harden Pharaoh's heart to punish them, the Egyptians. That's a pretty uncomfortable place to live. But by chapter 12, Pharaoh's had enough, and he wakes up in the middle of the night and he tells Aaron and Moses, get your people out of here. And in fact, I want you to go so badly, we will heap all of the provisions of everything that you need from the Egyptians' households onto you. Get out of here with your family, your livestock, everything we've given you, and go. And they do. Now, this is an interesting aside. Exodus 12:40 says, now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. It's a long time to be in slavery and oppression. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all of the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Now, I don't pretend to understand the significance of 430 days or 430 years to the Lord. It's a significant amount of time. Yet it was a big enough deal for God to deliver his people to the very day and make sure that that was recorded. Let us not lose sight as we consider the things in our own lives that we need deliverance from, that we are waiting and have yet to see come. that we watch God's kingdom deliverance come to the very day in his perfect timing, even when to us 430 years seems exorbitant. Exodus 13, Moses and Aaron, they continue to do what God tells them to do, even though it's counterintuitive. They're like wandering around the desert. It looks like they're lost as they try to deliver the people from the Egyptians. All of a sudden, Pharaoh realizes, what did I do? My slaves are all gone. All of our manual labor is gone. So they begin to pursue the Israelites, right? He sends his 600 best chariots and then all of the rest of the other chariots that aren't the best. And they pursue them. Israelites, you can guess, they begin blaming Moses and Aaron, right, for bringing them into the desert to die. They also begin to experience what I would call revisionist history, where they're like, hey, slavery was way better than this. Don't you remember that we asked you to leave us alone so we could serve the Egyptians? Not quite how the story went, at least by God's account. Moses gives them this inspiring speech. The Lord is going to fight for you. You just need to stand, right? And then he cries out to the Lord on behalf of his people. And do you know what the Lord says? Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to move on. It's so fascinating. This stuff is like, it's like reading a novel, right? But what we need to know is that God was with his people as they were being delivered. He was with them. He has a plan. He directs Moses. And then we see the angel of the Lord. He's going before the people of the Israelites, before them in a cloud, a pillar of fire, depending if it's day or it's nighttime, so they can travel anytime they need to. And then as we see God speak to Moses and say, you're going to part the seas, the angel of the Lord is said to have gone behind the people of Israel and to cover them and protect them. And one side could see only light and one side could see only darkness. So they could not be attacked by the Egyptians who were coming after them. This is amazing. So Moses does what the Lord commands. He parts the sea. The Israelites walk through on dry ground. A miracle all by itself. Not just the walls of water and everything, but like this bottom of the river, the ocean. Have you ever stepped in mud in a river? Like, you're not going to make it very far. And actually, that's exactly what happened to the Egyptians. God closes the water, and every single one of them drowns. Every single one who went after God's people did not make it. Now, then it says Israel saw that the Lord was mighty. They began to fear him, and they put their trust in God's people, his servant Moses. Now, this feels pretty good, right? Moses, he did all this work. He prepared through some pretty awful circumstances. He persevered. He endured. He's now responding despite his brokenness and sin. He spent 40 years of refinement happening in his own season of wilderness. Now at the age of 80, we see he's a reluctant leader, but he's continuing to say yes. The people of God placed their trust into Moses, and it feels like the inflection point is about to turn, doesn't it? That all of a sudden, like, God did it. And then do you know what happened? 3 days later, the Israelites were thirsty, and they began to blame Moses and Aaron for taking them into the desert to die. Again, they returned to their revisionist history in Exodus 16. They were talking about how they sat around like campfires and they ate good meat and they cooked in the pots and it was so lovely. We were merry and happy, right? And again, blame Moses for bringing the entire assembly out to starve to death. I wonder how often, at what point was Moses like, enough, God, right? So God provides. He sends quail, he sends manna, and he sends rest to these people who have had no rest for 430 years. The Israelites, though, they think they know better. God says, don't worry about going to collect manna or any food on the seventh day. I'll provide. And they're like, well, let's just go check. So they go and check, and they're like, well, that didn't work. God says, yeah, I'm going to re-invite you to receive and to rest. Again, they quarrel with Moses, no surprise, give us water. And we actually see in Exodus 17, God gives Moses some very specific instructions on what to do to get water from the rock, right? And he says, God says, strike the rock and the water will come out of it. And it did. Truly miraculous. Right? So this journey of Moses, his own flawed choices, the Israelites, their struggles with Moses, this journey from slavery and oppression towards freedom and promise, all of this is surrounded and held and carried by the faithfulness of an unconditionally loving God. It's so beautiful. And it continues to play out. So we're going to fast forward to two last places in Moses' life. The first is in Numbers, where we see this same thing that Moses experienced in Exodus 17 is repeated. There's another place, Numbers 22, where now there was no water for the community. And guess what the people did? They gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled and said, if only we died when our brothers fell dead. Why did you bring the Lord's community into the wilderness that we and our livestock should die here, right? On and on and on. This is a terrible place. There's no grain, there's no figs, there's no grapevines, there's no pomegranates. I thought we were going to the promised land, right? Their expectations had not been met. So Moses and Aaron, what they do is, again, they fall on their face before the Lord at the tent of the meeting, which is where the tabernacle, the portable tabernacle where they would meet with God. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord instructed Moses, take your staff, gather the assembly and speak to the rock, and water will pour out of it. So Moses raised his arm, struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Wait a minute, that's not quite what God said to do this time, was it? God said, speak to the rock. And instead, Moses leaned back on what he knew God had done before. The Lord then said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I gave them. So this week, I want you to go find something on YouTube. I mentioned earlier Rick Warren's quote. Mike and I just returned from the Vineyard National Conference, and I want you to go find this, Conversation with Rick Warren and Jay Pathak. Literally, if you put Rick Warren, Jay Pathak, and Vineyard Conference, it's going to come up, okay? And it should look like this. If you find something else, I don't know what you're watching. But Rick Warren shares this incredible piece. Specifically, I would suggest you start around minute 15. You can watch the whole thing. It's great. It's all about how do we actually, as churches, no matter how small or how big we are, how do we engage in the mission of bringing Jesus, being his witnesses to the ends of the earth? It's beautiful. But around minute 15, if you're going to go look. And he begins talking about how we reach the nations as witnesses, as the body together, cross-denomination, cross everything. It's beautiful. But specifically at minute 16:45, Rick Warren begins to speak about his own personal story and his journey with his son and his loss to battle with mental health and depression. And he shares his story of how people reach out to him in his grief after they lost their son. And he specifically talks about how people did not diminish his son's brokenness or his flaws, but instead they shared the testimony of Matthew, his son, leading them into the kingdom right in the midst of his brokenness. It's incredible, so touching. And so this phrase, broken trees bear fruit, comes directly from Rick Warren, from his own life and his own grief experience and journey. So I look at someone like Moses or any of the characters from Hebrews 11 that we've talked about, where broken trees bear fruit. What happened to Moses in those spaces that he was set aside in isolation, in loneliness, in hiding, in living under the weight of his past sin? In those 40 years of his leadership then being accused of ill intent. You're a murderer. You're here to kill us too. Being accused and attacked. And yet, rather than turning that into bitterness, he became an intercessor for his people. He said, God, help my people, over and over and over and over again, tirelessly. Patterns emerged in Moses' life where he persevered through these incredibly difficult circumstances. He continued to pursue the Lord and say yes, even though he would often bring his objections of no, right? He allowed himself to be transformed in the most flawed places of his heart and soul. He walked in obedience, offering what he had and allowing God to do the heavy lifting. When others would quarrel or grumble against him, he would petition the Lord. Now, he was not perfect, and he still had lots of refining to be done. He didn't always listen real well to what the Lord said. But I believe he came to a place of surrender in his transformation, because at the end of his life, we see what Hebrews 11:39 tells us, that these heroes of the faith were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. None of them had received what had been promised. God planned something better. So at the end of Moses' life, in Deuteronomy 32, we see God predict his death. And he tells Moses, hey, I need you to go climb Mount Nebo. This is 40 years after he's now wandered in the wilderness with the Israelites. So he's 120 years old, but apparently spry enough to still climb a mountain. So he says, climb Mount Nebo. There you will die and you will be gathered to your people. You will see the promised land, but only from a distance. I will not allow you to go in. So Moses, in response to that, what he does is his very last act of ministry is to go before the Lord on behalf of the tribes of Israel again. He blesses them. This is his last act of worship and ministry. He blesses the tribes of Israel one last chance to cry out on behalf of these rebellious and adulterous and accusatory people. He blesses with a full heart all of the goodness of the Lord over them. I love Moses so much. All right, the actual death of Moses happens in Deuteronomy 34. Moses climbs the mountain, okay? And it says, there the Lord showed him all of the land, the whole land. And he says, this is the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I've let you see it with their eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab. The Lord himself buried Moses in Moab. He was 120 years old when he died. Now, had Moses wanted to protest this final declaration of the Lord, this final design that he had, what do you think he would have done? Pardon your servant, Lord. I don't like this approach. Right? He was not a wallflower. He definitely raised his objections. I think that what's interesting is we see that God speaks a word, and then Moses, sitting on the side of the mountain, looks at the promised land and releases that he will not get to go into it. Surrender to the Lord, and he dies there, just him and his God. Hebrews 10:22 says, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, with full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, having our bodies washed with pure water. And as I consider what it means to draw near to God, Amelia, I'll invite you and the music team back up. Here are the questions that I want us to think about as we close, as we ourselves come before the Lord in worship, as we consider what he has for us this night. We will have people available to pray. You can grab someone next to you and pray if that's more comfortable. But I want to ask you these questions. Are you in a space maybe tonight where you have not received what you expected, or what you feel was promised, or what you had hoped would become? Maybe your expectations need to be reset today. I hope the Lord isn't inviting you into 40 years of isolation and loneliness, but I don't know what it will take for him to get those spaces in your heart that he desires to transform. Maybe you're in a place where your sin needs to be wiped clean, walking in full assurance of faith and sincere heart before the Lord's throne. There's an invitation to have all of it wiped away. I mean, who would say they would expect the priest who leads God's people to be the murderer of the bunch? God can use anyone. And maybe the Lord has given you dreams that you're reluctant to say yes to. And you're maybe in that place of saying, can't anybody else do that, God? I felt really clearly as I was praying for us tonight that there might be some of us who, like Moses, are learning to sit in surrender and acceptance instead of reluctance. So listen, would you just stand as we worship? Would you say yes to whatever it is the Lord is doing in your hearts? Would you be willing to grab someone and say, hey, I need to